They dragged her through the dust, naked, bloodied, hair torn. Once they had bowed before her. Now they jeered. 3 war horses stood waiting, ropes tied to each of her arms and legs. Her sentence was clear, but it wouldn't end with being torn apart. When the screaming stopped, the fire began. She was a queen, not by marriage, by will. Brunhilde of Austrasia ruled not just through her husbands, but through armies, alliances, assassinations, and sheer force of mind. In a world where royal women were meant to breed, bless, and remain silent, she governed. She negotiated treaties. She appointed generals. She executed rivals. And for that, they destroyed her. Today, few remember her name. Her portraits were burned, her legacy defamed. Historians, mostly male, mostly loyal to the victors, rewrote her into a villain, a sorceress, a manipulator, a demon. But the truth is far more complex and far more terrifying, because the fall of Queen Brunhilde was not just a personal tragedy. It was a royal assassination sanctioned by God, fueled by misogyny, and carried out by fire. The daughter of an empire. Brunhilde was born around 543 AD into the Visigothic royal family of Spain. She was not just noble, she was imperial. Her father was King Athanagild. Her upbringing was one of diplomacy, language, and strategy. At a time when women were rarely educated, Brunhilde was fluent in Latin, Greek, Gothic, and politics. She was raised not just to marry well, but to navigate the collapsing Roman world with her mind as her weapon. At 17, she married King Sigebert I of Austrasia, one of the 3 rival kings of the Frankish Merovingian dynasty, which had emerged from the ashes of Rome. Theirs was no ordinary union. Brunhilde converted from Arianism to Catholicism, aligning herself with Roman Orthodoxy and winning the support of the Church, a move that would later both empower and endanger her. She became Queen of Austrasia, but more than that, she became its spine. 2. Sister-in-law, enemy, executioner. Every great queen has a nemesis. For Brunhilde, it was Fredegund, the ruthless concubine-turned-wife of King Chilperic I, Sigebert's half-brother and bitter rival. Where Brunhilde was noble, literate, and diplomatic, Fredegund was brutal, cunning, and unrelenting. Their feud began with blood. When Sigebert was assassinated by Fredegund's agents, Brunhilde was captured, exiled, and later forcibly married to Merovec, the son of her enemy. She escaped, returned, and began to systematically rebuild power as regent for her young son, Childebert II. She didn't fade into obscurity like a proper widow. She governed, she declared war. She imprisoned Fredegund's allies, she punished traitors. And when her son came of age and ruled briefly, she continued pulling the strings. She wasn't just surviving, she was ruling for decades. And the nobles began to whisper, "She is too powerful. She rules like a man. She must be stopped." 3. The Queen Without a King. By the time Brunhilde reached her 60s, an astonishing age for a royal woman in the 6th century, she had outlived 2 husbands, 3 sons, and nearly every man who tried to control her. She had ruled as queen, queen regent, and queen grandmother, wielding influence over 3 generations of monarchs in the fractured Frankish kingdoms. But power had its cost. Her court was riddled with betrayal. The aristocracy despised her centralization. Bishops denounced her as a Jezebel. Even her own grandchildren turned against her, manipulated by jealous nobles and Fredegund's surviving faction. And then came Clotaire II, the son of Fredegund, the final hammer blow. 4. The fall begins. Clotaire II rose to power in Neustria and declared war on Brunhilde's realm. The old queen, now nearing 70, led armies in her grandson's name, desperately trying to hold together what remained of Austrasia. But betrayal came from within. Her great-grandson, Sigebert II, barely a teenager, was seized. The nobles defected. Brunhilde, now alone, unarmed and surrounded, was captured by Clotaire's forces. And then the trials began. Not legal trials, public humiliation, a show for the masses, a warning to any woman who dared think herself sovereign. Fee, the sentence. Clotaire accused Brunhilde of witchcraft, incest, murder, and tyranny, the usual charges leveled at women in power. She was blamed for the deaths of 10 kings and princes. She was called a seductress, a poisoner, a serpent. No proof was offered, no defense was allowed. And the punishment? Not exile, not prison. Execution by torture. Not just death spectacle. Because to erase a queen, they had to make an example. And to destroy a woman who ruled like a king, they needed fire. A body torn, a crown burned. The execution took place in autumn, in full view of the court and army. Brunhilde, now around 70 years old, was stripped naked. She was tied to the tails of wild horses, each limb pulled in opposite directions. Some accounts say she was dragged for miles, her body torn, bones broken, flesh flayed. Others say her remains were thrown onto a pyre, burned to ash while soldiers cheered. Her last words are unknown, her final expression lost to history. But her legacy refused to die, because in killing her, they revealed their fear, not of evil, not of corruption, but of a woman who ruled without permission. 7. Erased from history. After her death, Clotaire ordered every mention of Brunhilde removed from the royal record. Monasteries were paid to revise chronicles. Her name vanished from prayers, from paintings, from memory. She was turned into myth, a demonic queen who seduced and killed, a scapegoat for the sins of kings. But the truth survived in fragments, in letters, in poems, in bones, buried in forgotten chapels. A queen who governed for nearly 50 years through empire, war, and betrayal. A queen who was never meant to rule, but did. And for that, they burned her. The court fell silent when she entered, not because they feared her, but because they knew better than to speak in her presence. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't wave a sword, but behind every word was the weight of a throne and the scent of blood. Brunhilde ruled in an age that made no room for queens. The Merovingian dynasty, heirs to the old Roman provinces in Gaul, was a patchwork of fractured kingdoms. Austrasia in the east, Neustria in the west, and Burgundy in the south. It was a realm of warring brothers, fickle nobles, and bishops who answered more to God than to kings. Into this chaos stepped a foreign princess from Visigothic Spain, and she did the unthinkable. She held the kingdom together not with armies, but with paper, ink, marriage, and murder. The widow who refused to step aside. After the assassination of her first husband, King Sigebert I, Brunhilde had every reason and every expectation to retire to a convent. That was the fate reserved for royal widows. Veil your head, mourn in silence. Pray, obey, disappear. But Brunhilde refused to vanish. Instead, she demanded the regency of her son, Childebert II, who was just 5 years old. At first, the nobles scoffed. A woman, governing. But she had allies in the church and one decisive weapon, the people. Brunhilde understood something most kings never learned: the value of public trust. She rode out to towns, she heard complaints, she lowered certain taxes, she punished corrupt magistrates. And slowly, she turned herself from foreign queen to matriarch of Austrasia. But nothing bred enemies faster than competence. 2. A crown built on paper and death. To hold her fragile kingdom together, Brunhilde turned to the two tools available to her: marriage and bureaucracy. She brokered alliances by marrying off nieces and nephews. She reshuffled noble titles. She created a network of administrators loyal to her, not the regional warlords. But every promotion was a provocation. Every cousin married off to a southern count created a northern rival. Every tax reformed cut someone's income. And in a system where kings could be assassinated by kitchen servants or poisoned during mass, power wasn't secured by laws. It was secured by fear. Brunhilde began playing the game like the men around her, and she played it better. 3. The Queen's Justice. Between the years 580 and 610, Brunhilde was the most powerful figure in Frankish politics. But she wasn't merely a regent. She became a kingmaker, placing her descendants on thrones and ruling in their names well into their teens and 20s. She enacted legal reforms, some progressive protections for women in marriage and property disputes, and others brutal. She imposed heavy penalties on treason. She allowed public executions of rebellious nobles. She ordered the torture of suspected spies. In Neustria, Fredegund, her lifelong enemy, called her a witch. In Burgundy, bishops accused her of pride, a sin worse than lust. In Austrasia, some of her own counts began keeping armed guards near their beds at night. She was feared, respected, but increasingly alone. 4. Blood in the family. Power, when stretched across generations, begins to crack. Brunhilde placed her son Childebert on the throne, but when he died mysteriously at age 26, she became regent again, this time for her grandsons Theodebert and Theoderic. The two boys, barely teenagers, were married off, knighted, and paraded as symbols. But behind every proclamation, Brunhilde still pulled the strings. And they knew it. One grandson died young. The other, Theoderic too, ruled Burgundy under Brunhilde's influence until he too turned on her. She forgave betrayal more than once, but she never forgot, and she never let it go unpunished. The rise of Clotaire too. While Brunhilde worked to unify Austrasia and Burgundy, her oldest enemy, the House of Neustria, was watching, waiting. Fredegund, though dead by now, had a son, Clotaire II. He grew up hearing that Brunhilde had murdered his uncles, defamed his mother, and usurped the Merovingian right to rule. Whether true or not didn't matter. The narrative was set, and when Brunhilde's final great-grandson, Sigebert II, was declared king under her regency, Clotaire declared war. 6. The betrayals begin. Brunhilde was now in her 70s, still sharp, still calculating, but the tides had turned. Her court had grown resentful. The nobles hated her centralizing policies. The bishops never forgave her use of force, and worst of all, her grandsons no longer feared her. As Clotaire's armies advanced, the aristocracy cracked. One by one, lords switched sides. Brunhilde's remaining family were handed over to Clotaire without a fight. And she, the woman who had ruled for nearly 5 decades, was abandoned. No army, no crown, no son, only enemies. 7. Her enemies wrote the final chapter. Clotaire knew exactly what to do with her. He did not kill her quietly. He did not send her to a convent. He turned her death into a symbol, because it wasn't enough to kill the queen. He had to erase her reign from legitimacy. And for that, he needed the world to see her not as a ruler, but as a monster. So they accused her of incest with her grandson, of killing 10 royal men, of poisoning bishops and mocking God. No trial, no evidence, no appeal. Only a sentence, torture, then death. And for good measure, he made sure the execution would be legendary. 0. A queen, surrounded by wolves. By the time Brunhilde was tied to the horses that would end her life, she had been a queen longer than most of her enemies had been alive. She had written laws, raised kings, survived exile, assassination, slander, and betrayal. But she was never allowed to be remembered as a sovereign, only as a woman who dared to rule like a man, and burned for it. 9. What history tried to forget. When historians in later centuries looked back on Brunhilde, they called her ambitious, conniving, bloodthirsty. They quoted bishops who hated her policies. They cited letters written by her executioners. But what they didn't quote were the people who lived under her rule and saw roads built, laws enforced, taxes equalized, and courts expanded. Brunhilde was not perfect, but she was powerful, and she was punished for it. In part 3, we return to her final days, the humiliating march to execution, the torture, the fire, the silence afterward. Because sometimes history doesn't just kill its queens, it burns them until no one remembers they were ever queens at all. It wasn't quick. It wasn't clean. That was the point. They could have slit her throat in secret. They could have offered poison. They could have let her die in a convent bed, like so many royal widows before her. But she wasn't meant to fade. She was meant to burn, to scream, to be seen. Because some executions are not about justice. They're about erasure. And on that day, Under the grey sky of autumn, the rulers of Neustria didn't just kill a queen, they turned her body into a message. I captured. When Brunhilde was finally betrayed and handed over to Clotaire II, she was nearly 70 years old. Her joints ached, her vision blurred, but her mind, the mind that had ruled 3 kingdoms, was still sharp. She was given no trial, no list of charges she could answer, only a sentence whispered by bishops, shouted by nobles, death by torture. In public, her crime? They called it witchcraft, incest, murder, sacrilege. But the real crime was this: she ruled, and they hated her for it. 2. The parade of shame. She was dragged not in chains, but by horse through the towns she once governed, the same roads she had commissioned, the same plazas where her banners once flew. Now her face was blackened with dirt, her royal robes torn. She was spat on by children, mocked by priests. She was no longer Queen Brunhilde. She was that wicked woman. And this was not a simple parade. It was a calculated inversion of royal processions. Where once she had ridden in gilded carriages, she now stumbled barefoot. Where once trumpets announced her arrival, now drums of execution thundered ahead. And behind it all, Clotaire watched. 3. Torture begins. The chroniclers who wrote about her death disagreed on the exact methods, but one thing is certain: she was tortured before she died. Some say she was racked, stretched until her joints tore. Others describe red-hot pincers used to tear the skin from her arms and chest. Some mention broken fingers, ribs cracked, hair ripped from the scalp. She may have been tied to a wooden frame. She may have been beaten with rods. And through it all, she never confessed to anything, because there was nothing to confess, only history to rewrite. 4. The crowd gathers. On the day of her execution, the town square of Autun was packed, not with mourners, but with spectators. Men, women, children, priests holding crucifixes, nobles dressed in fur, vendors selling wine and bread, executioners sharpening blades and tightening rope. It wasn't just an execution. It was entertainment. And somewhere in the crowd were the very same people who once praised her wisdom, who bowed before her, who toasted her victories. Now, they came to watch her burn. Horses and rope. According to the most detailed accounts, Brunhilde was not simply thrown onto a fire. First, she was tied limb by limb to 4 wild horses, 1 rope for each wrist, 1 for each ankle. The animals were whipped, and the crowd watched. She didn't scream, not at first, but when the tension snapped tendons, when bones cracked, and her body bent in unnatural shapes, the silence broke. She was ripped, slowly, not all at once. The body of a queen disassembled by muscle and rope. Some said she died before the final snap. Others insisted she was still alive when the torches were lit. 6. The fire. Her mangled body was dumped onto a pile of wood and straw. No ceremony, no last rites. The flames were not lit by clergy, but by executioners in leather and iron, as if her soul was unworthy of salvation. She was a heretic now, a devil in the eyes of the court, a woman who had ruled men, and for that she would be burned like a witch. The fire took her slowly. Rotten flesh smoldered before it burned. The stench filled the square. The crowd went silent, because even the most bloodthirsty mob sometimes realizes they are watching a human being die. 7. Ashes and lies. When the fire died out, there was no royal burial, no tomb, no inscription. Her ashes were swept away, mixed with dirt, with horse dung, with the blood of the condemned. Clotaire declared victory. He claimed to have ended an era of darkness, but he didn't stop there. He paid monks to write false histories. He bribed bishops to erase her name from public prayers. He ordered portraits destroyed, letters burned. He didn't just want her gone. He wanted her never to have existed. 8. Memory is a fire that won't go out. But history is stubborn. Whispers of Brunhilde survived in footnotes, in contradictory chronicles, in the memories of those who knew what had really happened. She ruled for nearly 50 years, longer than most of her male counterparts. She held 3 kingdoms together. She survived assassinations, invasions, betrayal until the very end. And when she was burned, the flames didn't just consume her body, They exposed the fear beneath her enemies' crowns. Because what terrified them most wasn't her ambition, wasn't her ruthlessness. It was the fact that she succeeded. In Part 4, we explore how Brunhilde's legacy was rewritten, how queens across Europe were judged by her fate, how fire became a political weapon, and how history almost succeeded in turning a monarch into a myth. But the truth still flickers. In parchment, in ruins, in ash that never quite cooled. Her body was burned, but that wasn't enough. The real fire came afterward in ink. Because when a powerful woman dies in flames, her enemies do not stop at the body. They go after the memory. They seize the story. They twist every detail until the world forgets what she really was. Brunhilde's legacy wasn't just reduced. It was rewritten into a warning. And for centuries, that warning echoed in the minds of every woman who dared sit on a throne. History is written by the survivors. Clotaire II didn't just burn the queen, he burned her records. After her death, he commissioned monks, bishops, and court scribes to craft a version of Brunhilde's life that suited his narrative. In this new version, she was not a ruler, she was a witch, a corruptress, a puppet master who had poisoned her grandsons, seduced bishops, and murdered kings. These weren't biographies, they were executions in ink. The royal annals began calling her the she-wolf, the Jezebel of the Franks, the destroyer of sons. Her entire reign, nearly half a century of policy, diplomacy, military strategy, was reduced to gossip and slander. And for 1,000 years, that version stuck. 2. The burning brand. Brunhilde's execution set a precedent. She became the prototype of the dangerous queen, the one whose ambition led kingdoms to ruin. The kind of woman who had to be stopped, not by logic or law, but by flames. And her story bled into myth. Her name, when remembered at all, became a symbol of female corruption. In France, plays and poems turned her into a cautionary tale. In the church, she was cited as evidence that women should never rule without a man. Her death became political capital, and her ashes were used to smother every royal woman who came after. 3. The queens who came after. It didn't take long for Brunhilde's ghost to return, not as a memory, but as a threat. In England, when Empress Matilda attempted to claim the throne in 1141, chroniclers called her proud, unnatural, arrogant echoes of Brunhilde's rewritten image. When Isabella of France invaded England in 1326 to depose her husband, she was praised briefly but later remembered as the she-wolf of France. Coincidence? Or inheritance? In Spain, in Poland, in Byzantium, women who governed without male regents were painted with the same brush, too ambitious, too masculine, too dangerous. Not because they were Brunhilde, but because men feared another Brunhilde might rise. 4. The fire as tool. The image of burning itself, of public execution by flame, became the ultimate punishment not just for heresy, but for female defiance. Centuries after Brunhilde, women across Europe were accused of witchcraft, many with little to no evidence. What they shared wasn't magic, it was nonconformity. Speaking out in court, owning land, refusing to remarry, controlling money, raising armies. These were not crime, but they were threats. And for a society terrified of women with power, fire became the most symbolic solution. It was purification, they said, a way to cleanse the soul. But what they really meant was obliteration. The irony of control. Brunhilde governed through men, but not beneath them. She was regent for sons and grandsons, but it was her will, her network, her vision that kept the kingdom intact. And this terrified a society built on dynastic inheritance, where power was supposed to pass from father to son like land or a sword. Brunhilde broke that system, not by rebellion, but by being good at it. She appointed judges, built roads, funded churches, commanded armies. And in doing so, she showed the world that women could not only rule, they could outlive, outplay, and outgovern their male counterparts. Her real crime was that she succeeded in a role she was never meant to fill. Z6, rediscovery. For centuries, historians parroted the lies Clotaire planted. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that scholars began to re-examine the evidence, to compare contradictory sources, to notice the political motives behind the smear campaigns. What emerged was not a witch, or a monster, or a madwoman, but a leader. Brunhilde's letters, rare but real, revealed a woman fluent in law and Latin, negotiating alliances with Byzantium, managing rebellions in Gaul, directing bishops and dukes like chess pieces. Modern historians now place her alongside queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine and Theodora of Byzantium, not as anomalies, but as proof that women ruled when they had to, and ruled well. But her name remains obscure. Her statues are few, her voice still faint beneath the layers of ash and ink. 7. Smoke that stains. Brunhilde's body was destroyed. Her memory was buried. Her name blackened. But what Clotaire and his scribes didn't understand was this. Flames don't erase, they imprint. The execution was meant to silence her. But instead, it became a mirror, reflecting the brutality of those who feared her. Every scream, every rope, every ember said more about her killers than her. And somewhere in the bones of medieval Europe, in the ruins of palaces she once ruled, in the worn stones of churches she once funded, her legacy waits, not glowing, but smoldering. In part 5, we bring the story full circle. We'll ask, what does it mean when a queen must be burned to be forgotten? And how many more like Brunhilde were erased, not by death but by silence? We end not just with ashes, but with a promise. That history may try to forget its queens, but we won't. History doesn't forget all at once. It forgets in fragments. A name left out of a scroll, a portrait left unsigned, a tomb left unmarked. Brunhilde's bones were scattered, her body torn, her ashes lost. But her erasure didn't end in fire. It continued for centuries in silence. Because some queens are not buried once. They are buried twice. First in the ground, then in the story. After the fire, after Brunhilde's execution, her enemies celebrated. Clotaire II declared himself the sole ruler of all the Franks. He rebranded the age, a new beginning, free of female corruption. He rewarded nobles who had betrayed her. He appeased bishops who had once feared her. For a time, the realm seemed united. But beneath that unity was rot. Because Clotaire had not won by wisdom. He had won by slaughter. He had destroyed a queen, and with her, an entire generation of central reforms. Roads crumbled, courts collapsed, nobles returned to ruling like warlords. And yet, Brunhilde was blamed even in death for every failure that followed. It was easy to blame the dead, especially when you controlled their story. 2. The long silence. For nearly a millennium, Brunhilde's name remained buried under lies. She was mentioned in monkish chronicles always as a villain, never a queen, rarely a mother, almost never as a ruler. Schools didn't teach her, churches didn't pray for her. Even feminist scholars of later centuries hesitated, unsure if she was real or just a legend of ambition gone mad. But the documents were there, buried in monasteries, tucked in imperial correspondence, smeared in marginalia with one word again and again. Regina, Queen. 3. The pattern repeats. Brunhilde was not the first queen to be erased, and she wouldn't be the last. Empress Theophanu ruled the Holy Roman Empire as regent for a decade and was later described as arrogant and Greek. Isabella of Castile unified Spain and funded Columbus, but her legacy was drowned in the shadow of Ferdinand. Wu Zetian became the only woman to rule China as emperor, and for 1,000 years was called a whore, a killer, a usurper. These women ruled, and so they were rewritten, not just as flawed, but as unnatural. Their victories became suspicions. Their leadership became evidence of danger. Their power was pathologized, and their deaths, when violent, were always justified. 4. When the crown becomes a cage, what do you do when the throne is yours? But the world insists it doesn't fit your hands. Brunhilde faced this question her entire life. She was born to rule, educated, politically gifted, unapologetically commanding. But in a world where female authority was seen as aberration, not inheritance, every decision she made was suspect. When she punished rebels, she was called vindictive. When she governed during her son's minority, she was called manipulative. When she built a dynasty, she was called monstrous, because the sin was never in what she did, it was in who did it. V. The echo of fire. Brunhilde's execution sent ripples across time. It taught courts how to deal with inconvenient queens. Discredit, humiliate, burn. We saw it again in the fate of Anne Boleyn, executed on trumped-up charges of incest. In Marie Antoinette, paraded to the guillotine, accused of crimes no one could prove. In Joan of Arc, burned as a witch by a church afraid of her leadership. Each time, the story was the same. She is unnatural. She is dangerous. She must be silenced. Brunhilde's fire was not the first, but it lit the path for many that followed. V. The return of a name. Only in recent decades has the world begun to recover her story. Historians, combing through overlooked texts, began to see past the bias, to separate myth from fact, to recognize the smear campaigns for what they were, political assassinations dressed in piety and patriarchy. Today, Brunhilde is finally being recognized not as a villain, but as one of the first female heads of state in medieval Europe. Some modern scholars have called her the mother of the Carolingian Empire, citing how her reforms laid groundwork for later unification. Museums now name her. Exhibitions quote her letters. Biographies correct the lies. But her name is still faint, still flanked by words like ruthless, ambitious, deadly, because even now, power in a woman's hands remains complicated. 7. Final reflection. Brunhilde ruled for almost 50 years longer than most of the men who killed her. She endured betrayal, war, exile, and at the end, she died not with dignity, but as a warning. Her story was buried beneath 1,000 years of silence. But silence is not absence. It is pressure. It is weight. It is the space where truth waits. And now, we tell it again. Not just to remember Brunhilde, but to remember how history punishes women who lead, and how often it tries to make us forget they ever did. If you watched her burn and felt the fire, if you heard her silence and still listened, then join us in the next chapter. Because in our next dark history documentary, we uncover the story of a king who boiled his enemies alive and ruled through terror. History isn't clean, it's cruel, and we're just getting started. Subscribe now. More flames await.